in
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining today. My name is Vanessa. I am a research mentor here at Statistics Solutions, and today I'll be presenting on the Quantitative Methods chapter. Just before we get started, if you can hear me, go ahead and send a message in the chat. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So before we get started today, I just wanted to provide a little bit of information about Statistics Solutions. We are a full service dissertation consulting and editing company. We help students who are working on their dissertations all the way from the very early stages like topic development through to the final defense and PowerPoint presentation. We have both quantitative and qualitative mentors on staff. So today I'm going to be talking about the quantitative methods, but if you're interested in doing a study that's more qualitative in nature or mixed methods, we do have people on staff who work with students who are using those methods as well. And then we also provide assistance with things like the introduction and the discussion. So more of the research-based pieces, we do help with that as well. After this session today, you will all receive a copy of the slides as well as a recording, and we'd love to invite you all to, if you feel like you can benefit from some additional help or some more one-on-one consulting, to sign up for a free consultation where we'll talk to you about your research and identify ways that we can best support you. So today we're going to be talking about the quantitative methodology chapter. Again, I won't be talking about qualitative methods today, but if you do want to learn more about those, please refer to our website. We've got Sierra on the call today, and she's posted some links in the chat. So if you're interested in any other resources, they are available on our website there. So the different components that we'll be going over today are the introduction, the research design, population and sample, instrumentation, data collection procedures, data analysis plan, limitations, and ethical considerations. These are generally all of the components that you're going to include in the methods chapter. But I always recommend to students that you reach out to your reviewers or the chair of your committee to ask for a template or a checklist, just to make sure you're fully aware of the information that they're wanting you to include in the chapter. So this list and this presentation is pretty comprehensive, but of course, every school is different. So just make sure you are referencing the materials that your school has available before you start writing. That way, you don't make extra work for yourself and you're including everything you need. At the end of the presentation today, I will open it up for Q&A. So if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat throughout the presentation. And then at the end, we'll leave some time to discuss. So first, let's talk about the purpose of the methodology chapter and why it's important for the dissertation. So the purpose here is to describe how you're going to be conducting your research. In the previous chapters, before you got to chapter 3, namely the introduction and the literature review chapters, you are establishing why you're conducting your research. So in those chapters, you're really setting up your study and setting up for your reader about why the research needs to be conducted. Once you get to the methodology chapter, it's time to start describing how you're going to carry out that research. So how you're going to collect your data, how you plan to analyze it to answer the research questions, and really just establish any context that the reader will need as they go into the results and try to interpret your results. The important thing to keep in mind here is that this chapter should be as detailed as possible, almost like an instruction manual or a cookbook, so that whoever is reading it can replicate the procedures that you used to reproduce similar findings, or just to study the same thing that you are studying. So for that reason, a lot of people will liken the methodology chapter to an instruction manual. I always recommend to students, when you are starting out writing your methods, it's helpful to just create a bulleted list, going through every step that you took, all the way from getting your IRB approval, recruiting your participants, consenting your participants, sending out surveys, every single step that you took, no matter how small, kind of just create that bulleted list, and that will be the framework for this chapter. That will give you a good foundation to really start to build the narrative text around. So it can be helpful to start off with that list. And again, different schools will have different requirements, so I'll be covering each of these components today, but you'll just want to make sure to check in with your committee to make sure that this is in alignment with what they expect from you. So like most of the chapters in your dissertation, you're going to want to begin with a brief introduction. Here is where you are going to reorient the reader to your purpose for your study and your research questions, and then you'll lay out the contents of the chapter. So you can start your introduction with a restatement of your purpose or problem statement. This can be written either verbatim, or it can be an abbreviated version of your purpose or problem statement. You may also want to restate your research questions here. Now, when you are restating your research questions, you want to make sure that they are stated verbatim, the exact same way that they appear in other areas of your dissertation. So you want to make sure that the wording of the research questions and any hypotheses stay the same throughout the dissertation. And that's just because different words have different meanings. So if you make a slight change, it may create like an alignment problem where it sounds like you're studying something that you're not. So just want to make sure you're being consistent with those research questions all throughout the dissertation. It may start to feel redundant, but feel free to just copy and paste those down any place where they belong. And then after that, you can simply list out the different section headings that will appear in the chapter to give the reader a preview of what you'll be talking about in this chapter. Next, one of the first things that you'll talk about is the justification for your research design. So here you will want to state the research design that you selected and provide the rationale for why you selected it. It's important to note here that some schools will require you to not only discuss the specific research design within quantitative methods, so not only saying, you know, I selected a case study or I selected a correlational study, but also to talk about the particular research method. So you may have to identify for your reader what a quantitative method is and why you selected a quantitative method as opposed to qualitative or mixed methods. So here, in this case, the general research method would be quantitative, and then the research design will be whatever design you selected within that quantitative framework. You will want to state the specific research design that you've selected. So it could be correlational, experimental, quasi-experimental. Those are just a few examples of quantitative research designs. And in doing that, you will want to identify what those are best used for, or what the one that you've selected is best used for, and how that aligns with the problem, purpose, and research questions in your study. So what are you intending to study, and how do the features of your design make sense for that? Another way that you can provide rationale for your selection is by showing the reader why other studies don't make sense. So for example, if your research questions involve looking at relationships, then a correlational study may be appropriate for your dissertation. So that would be kind of the justification there. And then when you are showing how other designs don't make sense, you might say something like, you did not select an experimental or quasi-experimental design because you have a study that does not have to do with comparing experimental groups, or maybe the variables of interest in your study cannot be manipulated. So if you're studying smoking, for example, you can't assign a group to smoke. So maybe instead you would look at correlations between groups and health outcomes. So once you have provided why you selected your design, why you didn't select other designs, then you'll have established this rationale, and then you can move on to the next section. And that is going to be the population. Here, it's important to note and kind of remind yourself back to your stats classes that the population and sample are slightly different. A lot of students might use these terms interchangeably, but you really want to make sure to distinguish between the two in your study. So the population is the broad group of individuals that your results are intended to generalize to. So in terms of population, it is going to be the group that your study is about. So for instance, if you are doing a study in education and the individuals that you're attempting to study are teachers, then your population in that case would be teachers in the United States, maybe. And then your sample would be the smaller group of teachers in the United States that actually participate in your study. So that could be 35 teachers or 300 teachers within your local school district. So really just identifying what that larger population is and then who the sample is. Here you'll want to make sure to identify both. Once you state the population of interest, you will want to describe the characteristics of that population. And you can use different resources to do this. So if your population is teachers, for example, you might head over to the Bureau of Labor Statistics website and take down some statistics for teachers. So some things you might want to identify are the demographic breakdown, the size, how many teachers are there in the United States. You may want to look at highest levels of education, really whatever characteristics or demographics you believe are going to be important for your reader to know as they move through your methods and also your results section. So for example, if you're doing a study particularly on female teachers, it may not be important to provide a breakdown of the gender, in the overall population. Whereas if it's just teachers, that might be an important characteristic. So really just identifying what things are going to be important for the reader to take with them into the results so that they can interpret what you've analyzed. And then for the sample, you will basically do the same thing. So the sample includes the individuals of people that you've selected to participate in your study. So again, it's going to be that smaller group out of the population. You will want to here describe your sampling strategy or technique. So in these studies, random sampling is typically the gold standard. In some instances, you might use convenience sampling, whichever is most appropriate for your study. You'll just want to identify what that technique was and how you did it. Then you'll want to describe how the sample will be selected from the population and recruited into your study. So what are the recruitment methods that you intend to use for this study? Will you be cold calling people? Will you be posting flyers in Facebook groups? Will you be posting a flyer in, a local organization? Whatever that process looks like, you will want to outline it here. And then talk about the steps. So once a participant sees your flyer or receives your email or whatever it may be, what are the next steps that they need to take or that you need to take in order to enroll them in the study? You'll want to identify those as well. And then you may want to calculate a target sample size. So that is something that you can use power analysis to do. We do have specific presentations on power analysis, noting that when you're doing a quantitative study, the sample size is going to be important to really estimate the power of your study and how generalizable it is to the greater population. So I won't go too much into power analysis, but we do have those resources available if it's something that you might want to do for your study. And then the next section is going to be instrumentation. Here is where you will lay out and describe each instrument that you're going to use to measure different variables in your study. So by the end of the instrumentation section, you should have described every single instrument that's going to be used in relation to your research question. So each variable that's mentioned or listed in your research question should have some type of instrument to measure it. So for example, if you have 3 research questions and the first is related to smoking and cardiovascular risk, and then the second is related to smoking and maybe maternal health outcomes, you want to make sure that in this instrumentation section, you're identifying the instruments for smoking outcomes, cardiovascular risk outcomes, and also maternal health outcomes. So really making sure you're including every single variable that you've already outlined in earlier chapters. Here you're going to describe these instruments. So not just naming them, but really giving the reader an idea of what they are. And you may use an appendix to provide further insight into that. So you want to let the reader know how many questions there are or how many items there are in each instrument. And also you want to talk about the response categories. So is it a binary question where they just respond yes or no? I smoke, yes or no? Or is it some type of scale where they're indicating how many cigarettes they've smoked in the last 30 days, something like that. You just want to identify what that looks like. And then you'll want to talk about the scoring as well. So when the instrument is being put together at the end, are you simply taking like a sum of the responses? Are you taking an average? And what do those scores mean? So one example, the patient health questionnaire for depression, that's a 2-item instrument. And in that instrument, you would take a sum of the scores to indicate whether or not the person has depressive symptoms or not. So whatever the scale is that you're using, you'll just want to identify how it's interpreted. And you can use information from your literature search to find that information and also to cite it here to make sure you're supporting your statements. Some other or some additional information that you'll want to provide are the instrument's validity and also any reliability metrics that have already been found for this instrument. So again, a lot of this can come from your literature search, especially if you're using a validated instrument. More likely than not, it's been used before. So you can really pull from that to identify these characteristics of your instruments here. And then as far as data collection procedures go, this is where you really want to get into that step-by-step mode. So this is the list that people are going to kind of take and repeat each step that you took. So you want to start from beginning to end, beginning from when you typically, you got your IRB approval, and then what is the next thing you did? So thinking through IRB approval all the way to when you are ready to analyze your data, giving as much detail as possible. So for instance, if you are doing a survey study, you'll want to identify the modality of that study. Is it a survey that participants take online? Is it a survey that they need to come in person and take with a pen and paper? You'll also want to talk about where it's being taken if it is in person. If you are studying teachers, are they taking this survey at their place of employment? Are they doing it at a library? Whatever that may be, because it might have implications for future bias that you might identify in the limitations of your study. Then you'll want to provide information about how many participants will be providing information and how the participants will consent. So informed consent is the process through which participants are given information about the study before they provide any data so that they can make an informed decision about whether they should participate or not. And so you will want to give information about how participants will be given that informed consent and how they're going to indicate that consent. So again, if you are doing an in-person study where you're giving out a paper or pen survey, you would usually give them a consent form before you give them the survey so that they can read the form and sign it to indicate that they understand the study and that they're willing to participate. If you're doing an online study, then usually the consent information is presented in the first page of the online survey so they can read the information about the study and then kind of click through some type of checkbox or, e-signature to indicate that they've read all of the information and agree to participate. Here you'll also want to talk about how and when each instrument is going to be administered. So again, if you're doing in person versus online, how and when will the process occur? In what order do you plan to present the instruments and things like that? And importantly, if you're doing something like a longitudinal study or repeated measures or like a pre-post research study where participants are completing measurements at different time points, that's where this becomes very important. So you'll want to very clearly identify what instruments participants are taking at each time point. So everything I've talked to you up to this point is related to primary data collection, but some people might be doing some type of secondary data analysis where they are using pre-existing or archival data. So if you fall in that category, this section will look a little bit different from you or for you, as opposed to primary data collection where you're really doing it all yourself. In the data collection procedures for archival data or secondary data collection, you will instead be talking about the different permissions that you received or the process that you went through to access the particular data that you're using for your study. So for example, the CDC has a lot of large data sets, and in order to access them, sometimes you need to write, a 1 to 3 page justification for why you need the data, and you'll need to submit that and wait a certain period for approval. So if you are doing a study that requires that type of process, instead of identifying, where and when data was collected and things like that, you'll identify the process that you went through to get permission or access to your data. So after you have described your data collection procedures, you will want to lay out a plan for how you intend to analyze the data and answer your research questions. So here you should have a very specific data analysis plan for each research question that's posed in your study. First, you will want to talk about how the data will be compiled or entered into an electronic format. This is especially important if you are doing in-person research with like a paper pen survey. You will want to identify how you plan on manually entering the responses to the surveys into an electronic format. So it could be that you're typing them into an Excel sheet, If that's the case, you'll want to talk about that process and also identify how you are making sure that the data is accurate. So are you having quality checks? What are you doing to make sure that you're plugging it in correctly? Next, you'll want to state the software that you're going to be using for any data cleaning, preparation, and analysis. So you might use something like SPSS or SAS. Maybe you're using Tableau, whatever it is, you'll just want to identify the software that you're going to be using. And then you will want to describe your data cleaning procedures. So one important thing to look for is any missing data. So how do you intend to check for missing data? And if there is missing data, how are you going to deal with those missing responses? Especially if you're doing a survey, it's very likely that you're going to have participants that skip a question or skip many questions. So you may not have 100% complete data. So you just need a plan for how you're going to deal with that. Some things that you might do, you might remove participants who skipped questions. That might be, the extent to the plan for missing data. Other things that you might do, you might want to keep those participants in and maybe just create a mean replacement or impute those values that are missing with some kind of imputation procedure. So there are, a number of different methods that you can use to deal with missing data. It's just a matter of what makes sense for your study. But those are all details that you'll want to provide for this section. And then you'll want to describe how you are going to screen your data for any eligibility criteria. So if you are, again, we'll go with our teacher example. If you're doing a study of teachers, maybe you are particularly interested in special education teachers. and you put a flyer in your local high school and you get 500 surveys in or something like that. How are you going to make sure that all of those surveys are special education teachers? This is the area where you'll want to describe that process. So it may be that at the top of your survey, if it's an online survey or even in person, you just have a few questions that are confirming that eligibility criteria. Are you a teacher who works in the XYZ school district? Yes or no? Do you teach special education? Yes or no? And that would be sufficient to identify that these indeed are the participants that should be completing your study. Next, you'll want to talk about any procedures that you need to do to prepare or compute your variables to use in the analysis. So again, if you're using survey instruments to measure maybe a variable like self-esteem, what procedures do you have to follow to do any coding or recoding of those survey responses in order to compute a score for self-esteem? So you'll want to describe all of those procedures. And thinking back to that depression example, it may be that you need to create a variable that takes a sum of two particular questions to get at what you're looking for. So whatever that looks like for you, you'll just want to describe that here. And then after that, you will describe the steps for data preparation. And you can do that, you can start out doing that by describing any basic descriptive statistics that you're going to conduct on your data. So typically you'll want to present descriptive statistics on any demographic information that you collect, as well as for the variables of interest in your study. So if we're going back to that example of cigarettes, we want to know what percentage of participants smoke, what percentage of participants have maybe cardiovascular conditions. So just identifying what the distribution of those different conditions or variables is within your sample. And then finally, you'll get into your main analysis. So how are you actually going to answer your research questions or hypothesis? For this part, you'll want to separate it out by research question. So you may say for research question 1, I intend to do a chi-square test of independence to identify associations between smoking and cardiovascular outcomes. So something like that. You'll just want to clearly state what the statistical analysis is for each research question. And then going along with that, some analyses will have different assumptions that need to be met in order to do them. So for example, if you are going to conduct a t-test for your study, maybe one of your aims requires a t-test, you need to make sure that your data conforms to the assumptions of a t-test. So normality and homogeneity of variance are the two assumptions of t-tests. So in addition to talking about the actual analysis, you will want to talk about how you are checking the assumptions. So to test normality, you might look at the values of skewness or kurtosis in your data and identify if there's any outliers. And then to test homogeneity of variance, you might do something like a Shapiro-Wilks test. So here you'll just identify those things. And you'll also talk about what you're going to do if any of the assumptions are violated. So what happens if your data isn't normal? Will you proceed and still run your t-test, or are you going to transform your data to make it more normal? What do you have in mind to deal with that? If you are doing an analysis that requires a normal distribution, so like a t-test, and it doesn't, one alternative, instead of transforming your data or excluding outliers, might be to switch from using a t-test to a non-parametric test that doesn't require that normality assumption. So again, getting back to those introductory stats courses, here's where you're going to want to pull that out. And then next, you will talk about limitations. So here, you most likely have already thought about the different limitations, whether it's related to your data collection or the particular design of your study. But here you'll want to talk about what those things are. So you can start out by listing the limitations that are associated with your research design. So I've listed a few common limitations out here. So for example, if you're doing a correlational study, we know that correlation does not explain causation. So just because we find some associations within our variables, it doesn't mean that there's a cause and effect relationship happening. There may be other factors that we haven't measured. If you're doing a survey study, there's potential for response biases. So for example, if you are doing a study of maybe individuals who smoke, it could be that participants underreport the amount that they smoke because they feel like they need to like kind of present themselves in a brighter light or something like that. So there may be some social desirability bias coming into play with your responses. So you may get an underestimated amount of smokers in your sample than what's really there. And then things like pre and post studies, a few threats to validity are attrition, testing effects, history, and maturation. So those are some things to be aware of as well. And then if you are doing an experimental study, we always have to consider the external validity of the study and whether or not these findings can be generalized to the larger population. So these are a few limitations that you might talk about. But again, these are things that as you are doing your literature search, you will come across hallmark limitations for each study. And then some schools will also want you to discuss different limitations related to like researcher biases or anything that went on in your data collection that may have limited your study. So for example, if you were doing your dissertation in 2020 and you intended to do in-person recruitment, and then the pandemic hit and maybe you weren't able to recruit participants as much as you had liked because of social distancing and all the different mitigation techniques, that would be a pretty big limitation, you know, having to switch to virtual recruitment and maybe not reaching the sample size that you intended. So different things like that you can also talk about here. And then usually one of the last sections that you will talk about is going to be the ethical considerations. And this is where you describe the different ethical issues that are relevant to your research. So usually the ethical issues are based in the principles that are laid out in the Belmont report. The three main principles identified in that report are beneficence, justice, and respect for persons. And usually schools will want you to ground this section in these three principles and specifically how you intend to uphold them in your study. You may also want to talk about the Irb approval for your study because virtually all research will require some type of Irb approval, so you can talk about that. You'll also want to talk about the informed consent process. So how did you ensure that participants were aware of the procedures and could clearly make a decision as to whether or not they wanted to participate? And also, how did you identify any risks for the participants? So if you are doing a survey study, like if you're just having participants fill out a survey, typically there's less than minimal risk or minimal risk involved in that type of study. So you'll want to identify that here. Technically, we never say that there's no risk because there could always be something. So, it could be that you are asking survey questions that are triggering for people, or, maybe difficult for people to answer. So typically you'll say that the study involves minimal risk. So here you'll want to talk about that. And if your study involves more than minimal risk, you'll want to provide a lot more details on what you're going to be doing to mitigate those risks. So if you are doing a study on a topic that is sensitive or may, bring up different trauma for participants, one way that you might mitigate that risk is by having people available or providing phone numbers or support people to those participants to discuss any potential trauma that they experience or that they recall from taking the survey or participating in your study. Another thing you can do is provide resources to them. So for example, if you are working on a college campus, you can provide the number to the counseling center if you're surveying students. So just thinking about, what things might come up for the different people that are going to participate in your study. You may here also want to reference the fact that participants are participating on a voluntary basis, and that if they do feel distressed at any point, they can stop participating in the study, and that there are no negative consequences associated with discontinuing their participation. Especially if your study involves more than minimal risk, you just want to be as detailed as possible about how you're going to be handling those potential risks and how you're going to be protecting participants from harm. And then the last thing you'll talk about here is how you're going to be storing the data and also how you're protecting participant identities. So typically you will want to make sure that the forms, the surveys, everything, all of the data that you've collected is de-identified. So you aren't linking participant names to the data. Maybe you're using ID numbers or pseudonyms, whatever it is. You'll want to identify that. And then how are you going to be storing the data? So if you're collecting your survey online, are you using software that's encrypted? Are you password protecting any files to make sure that, this data isn't just available for anybody to access? And then if it is a paper and pen survey, how are you keeping that safe? So it could be that you have a file cabinet in your office and you're keeping those forms under lock and key. It could be that you destroy the paper surveys once you input the data into an Excel form, and then that form is password protected. So just thinking here through how you intend to protect and store this data. You'll want to add those details here, and also talk about what you're going to do with the data once the study has been completed. So once you've written your dissertation, you've defended it, you've published it, is that data still sitting on your computer or in your file cabinet? Typically, people will destroy the data after 5 years. So you'll just want to identify that process here as well. But that does bring us to the end of the presentation today. Again, you'll all receive copies of these slides. So I know we went through things a little quickly, but this information will be available to all of you. And we also have webinars pretty frequently. So if you want to pop in for another, we are here for that as well. I will leave this slide up here in case anybody is interested in reaching out for that complimentary 30-minute consultation. And also Sierra has posted some links in the chat to help with that as well. And I see that I have a few questions in the question box, so I will go ahead and start answering those.